College football nerds here in preview season talking Georgia football. We've been away for a while, but we are back. I want to remind you, in case the sleepy Google algorithm juice has not been giving you notifications, we've done a ton of previews already, and we did a really good 4-part series on NIL and transfers in the state of college football, so you might want to check that out too. Got Josh with me, obviously getting nerdy with me on this one. And Josh, I haven't had a chance to say this since we last saw our Georgia friends, but a lot of Alabama fans on Twitter are talking about how Alabama would have won if they didn't have some wide receiver injuries. And I got two words for Alabama fans: Colt McCoy. They don't want to hear anything from Texas fans about how Texas would have won 2009 national championship if Colt McCoy wasn't hurt, and they tell him, shut that business down. There's no asterisk next to our championship. And then they're doing the same thing. Are they doing the same thing, Josh?
They are. They are, because everybody does. Now, I do think they would argue that there's a difference, right? Because they would say, well, we already played Georgia this year, and we already beat Georgia this year, and we beat them badly. So it's not the same as Colt McCoy because, we already know we could be the better team. But I don't think we really believe that's necessarily accurate either, do we?
Well, look, I think that both of these wins, and this is where I look at it, is like I think both of these wins were earned. Alabama's win in the SEC championship game was earned. Georgia's win in the national championship game was earned. And it's unfortunate that they weren't healthy and there wasn't a third game, a best 2 out of 3, because they were the two best teams in the country. One thing I'll say about that game, because it also kind of plays into this season's schedule as well. A lot of people didn't talk about this, but I think Alabama sort of shocked Georgia in a way that Clemson has been shocked in the past, and sometimes good for Clemson, in that Georgia's schedule wasn't particularly tough last year, and Georgia dominated it. So there wasn't a question about whether or not Georgia deserved to be in the national championship game or in the playoffs or any of that. They deserved what they got in the postseason, but I think that when you see... When you play a bunch of teams and have kind of a quote-unquote easy for you schedule, and then you play a team that's on another level in a championship round of some kind, be it that championship, conference game or in the playoffs or even in a bowl game, it can shock you a little bit. And it can make you artificially worse than you actually are because you're just a little sleepy, because it takes you a little bit more to get sharp. I'll say Georgia fans can appreciate this. Facing Baker Mayfield in the Rose Bowl, it took them 2 quarters to figure that game out. And then they woke up and, handled their business in the second half. It was a completely different team. But Baker Mayfield definitely shocked them for 2 quarters. And I think that there's a potential for that to happen this year because of their schedule, but also there's the flip side. So, Josh, I want you to talk about both. One, the kind of the potential negative of if you cruise all year and be shocked, but also what we've seen from Clemson as a positive, like 2018, where they can stay healthy and they can hide some things and maybe shock their opponent. So talk about that a little bit.
It's always interesting when you see a team that really doesn't bring back a ton of talent, but they also don't have the schedule that's going to necessarily challenge them. It's funny because they opened with Oregon, and we talk about a lot of times that everything in college football is relative, and the way we evaluate you is relative. Says a lot about where we're evaluating Georgia, that we talk about the opener against Oregon, and we're not necessarily scared about it. Now, we'll do a preview of that game. I don't want to go into it any further because I just don't want to have to. But after that game, you get Sanford, South Carolina, Kent State, Missouri, all the way down to Auburn in the middle of October. And for several weeks, you haven't really played anyone that has a roster anywhere comparable. And in fact, I'm not sure that Auburn either qualifies. So at that point, maybe you're talking all the way down to the October through November stretch before things get difficult. And in that vein, Georgia has a lot of time to figure things out. And, I think it's kind of interesting to sort of balance it, right? Because, when you talk about rosters and turnover in rosters, for years we've been in this position where Alabama has been sort of judged and then forgiven for the fact that they recruit so well that it doesn't matter how many guys they lose. And for a long time, everybody would say, well, they lost this many draft picks, this many draft picks are going to take a step back. Or at least the fans did. I think the media caught on a little faster than the fans that it didn't really matter. They were still going to be really, really good. But even there, I think we've kind of swung that pendulum too far, because the reality is they did take steps back. Alabama defensively, 2010, 2013, 2017, 2019, those were not phenomenal defensive teams. In fact, at times they weren't even particularly good on defense in those years. And they had some pretty significant weaknesses that in every one of those seasons really came to bite them. So you do take something of a step back. If you want to figure out where the line is and how you reconcile those 2 points, it's that you can take a significant step back from 2021 Georgia and still be a top 5 defense. When you have the kind of defenses that Georgia just put out in 2021, that Alabama put out in 2016, that Alabama put out in 2009 and 2011 and 12, those teams are, from an analytics perspective, they're a standard deviation. The 2021 Georgia team, 2016 Alabama team, those teams on our metrics were 2 or 3 standard deviations from, not just from normal, from anyone else. If you want to take tier rankings, like if you want to grade someone 0 to 5, there were 129 teams between 0 and 3, and there was Georgia at 5. There was no one at 4. So Georgia can jump back. They can jump back 2 notches, okay? And if they jump back 2 notches, they still might be in the 0 to 3 range. They're still a 3, which is as good as anybody else was. So Georgia can take a significant step back, and I think they probably have to. Given just the insane talent, they've got to take a step back. Doesn't mean they're going to be bad. Still means they may be one of the best teams. And, we made sort of the opposite point in the Michigan preview, and I kind of hated I didn't get to it, so let me make the point now. And I hate that it's more of a negative for Georgia. But the point I made is when you talk about guys going in the draft, the higher they go in the draft, it's great for your program. It looks great on TV. It's something you want to happen, but it does mean that I'm going to be a little more critical the next year. 2019 LSU lost a lot more talent than people expected, a lot higher. Not just the offensive side of the ball. They had first rounders on defense. People didn't see coming because they weren't a great defense for a lot of that year. And that said a lot about how I viewed them going into the following season. Now, Georgia recruits better than LSU did at that time period. But when you see Trayvon Walker go as the number 1 draft pick ahead of Aiden Hutchinson, that tells me that when we hyped that game and we talked about the best player in that game, all of us didn't really know who that was because it wasn't Hutchinson, it was Walker. And that does also mean that Georgia lost a more important piece than Michigan did. Now, the question is, how well can you replace it? And I think that's where really it all circles back to the schedule, the fact that you have a lot of time to prepare for the schedule. You have a lot of time after this Oregon game to sort of tune up and get things figured out and tweak. And I'll say, you look back at the records of these teams from last season, there are only 2 teams on this 2022 schedule that had 8 wins. That's Oregon and Kentucky. Everybody else was 7-6 or worse last season. Barely 500. Everybody but 2 teams. So Georgia does have a relatively weak schedule. It does mean they have plenty of time for these young defenders who are extremely talented to gel. And again, if you want to talk about the examples of 2017 Alabama, 2010 Alabama. 2010 Alabama was probably the best team in the country when they played their bowl. But it took a long time to get there, and they lost too many games along the way. I think Georgia has the luxury of time, and their roster, because of the way they recruit, is going to be very good. And I think it is going to be fair to criticize them amid the midway point. We'll be a little hypercritical. They're not going to be as good as they were last year. But none of that really matters. As long as they can get to where they need to be really by November, this is still going to easily be one of probably, one of the 2 real premier playoff contenders with Alabama in the SEC that's going to be vying for Ohio State. And it really feels like it's, in my mind, it's almost a no-brainer that those 3 teams, Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia, are the most talented teams and should be the best teams in the country. And it's just a matter of seeing what happens.
Josh, I'm a little frustrated. And if I'm a Georgia fan, I'm really frustrated. And I mentioned this frustration about Michigan in our Michigan preview. And I think there's something similar going on with Georgia in that, I feel like the national media is not giving Michigan their due respect on what they did last year and what they've got coming back in terms of roster this year. And everybody's just assuming that Ohio State's going to retake the crown, and Michigan's going to be okay with second fiddle. And I feel like some of that is I get that same feeling with Georgia, where they're not like the national media is talking a lot about Alabama, and they should be. They're good, but Georgia's got the hardware. They've been an elite team for the better part of a decade. They've been consistent, and now they have the national championship hardware to go with it. And they've developed teams. You talked about the Alabama reload kind of thing. And I feel like they're not getting their due. But, we talked about maybe the schedule being a little bit light. Do they earn their due in this stretch of Florida, Tennessee, Mississippi State, and Kentucky, and maybe flex a little muscle where people are sleeping on Georgia until November or late October 29th is Florida? They sleep on Georgia, and then finally, this is an opportunity for Georgia to say, okay, yeah, we haven't gone anywhere.
I definitely think it's a possibility if it's not extremely likely, right? That, they're going to go into that October, November timeframe, and, they're going to be wherever they're going to be. And assuming that they've won the games to that point, which I think they probably should, then I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to produce. There probably will have been some warts that pop up from time to time, but at that point they're going to earn their keep, because it's not an easy run. You get Florida, you get some time off. I think they'll be motivated. I know we're not Florida's fans' favorite channel because we've been critical of AR-15. Now, I was the terrible, horrible person that said that AR-15 wasn't really ready to start at quarterback going into the Georgia game, and obviously I was completely wrong about that because he just lit up Georgia for 700 yards. But I mean, other than the false realities that certain people live in, I do think Florida, then Tennessee, then Mississippi State, then Kentucky in a row is pretty challenging. As I said, there's two teams on the schedule that won 8 or more games, and there were two 10-win teams, one of which is Kentucky. And you've got some kind of scary teams in Tennessee. And again, Florida, I don't know what they're going to look like under Napier. I think they're going to be more competent than they were at times the last 2 years, and certainly more competent than they were at the end of last season. So Georgia's going to have to really kind of get things together and to win games to get through that point. I think it's notable that the over-under win total, which we looked up as I was trying to figure this out, is 10.5, right? Because Vegas is essentially saying, in my mind, it's kind of like it's a 50-50 shot. In Vegas's mind, do they lose one game and they lose two? That's not really fair, I will say, because when Vegas sets those lines, they do it knowing the 2019 Alabama scenarios happen, right? You never know when a team is going to have mass injuries. So that's why you don't see like 11.5, because there's a 1 in 10 shot that you lose your starting quarterback and 3 linemen, and that is actually kind of accounted for in those over-under win totals. But I do think it's notable that they're not expected to sleepwalk. So if it's cool with you, can we go ahead and jump into the roster discussion and talk about how feasible it is?
Yeah, I will say that you can't call him AR-15 anymore. He denounced that name, and you might have just demonetized us, but that's okay.
Well, that is what it is. Nicknames are what they are.
I will say one more thing before we get into the roster, because Georgia fans probably don't hear this as much because they usually play a pretty tough schedule. We talked about this with Ohio State, and I want you to give this a little bit of airtime, a little bit of thought, and flesh this out. Somebody's going to look at this schedule and say they're not going to play anybody, and they don't realize, one, a lot of people discount Kentucky being a solid team because of the brand name, even though they keep beating good Big Ten teams in bowl games. Like, if somebody else beat Kentucky out of the SEC, it would be a good win, right? But because Georgia beats them, it doesn't count. It's nothing, right? 30-13 over Kentucky, even though they won 10 games, it's nothing. There might not be a top 5 team in that 4-game stretch, but just give a little bit of airtime to how that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a hard schedule, because a 4-game stretch of good teams is often tougher than a 1-game stretch of an elite team.
I think that can be true. I mean, I do think certainly when you're playing a top 3 overall team, it's probably the hardest thing. But if you're talking like playing one number 10 team versus 3 teams that are 15 through 20, I think it does wear down on you. You don't have as much time to spend on it. And I think, to your point, it is a little a little crazy at times how some teams just don't get any credit. And I think Kentucky, probably more than any, doesn't get credit for what they did last year. I mean, they beat Iowa in a bowl, what was supposed to be a very good Iowa team. And we just had a preview where we're talking about Michigan and the Iowa game and how hard that's going to be. Kentucky was a better team than Iowa last year. And people are going to look at that Kentucky game as just being, it's just another average game on the schedule. It's tough. It's hard. It's a big deal to go through those. And Georgia is going to make it, has made it look relatively easy. I was going to say going to, it's probably premature, but I think they're not going to get the credit they should for playing teams like that. And it is difficult to play high-level SEC teams, multiple of them in a row. Because if you want to talk overall quality, not rankings, but quality, probably half the SEC in a given year is a top 30 team in quality. Maybe more than that in a lot of years. And so it's, you can talk about number of ranked wins and ranked games, but it's all kind of crap in a way. Because you get these 4 or 5 loss SEC teams. Like Ole Miss was a great example last year. Ole Miss was a good, dangerous football team, but they kind of ended up, up and down a little bit, and they lost games to good teams, and they end up with a not phenomenal record, but a good one. End up playing Baylor, lose that game, and now people don't really take it as seriously as they should. And Texas A&M was another good example. They lost a number of games to SEC teams, beat Alabama. They were a dangerous team all year. It doesn't get taken seriously. But, and I'm going to segue this hard, the thing that Georgia has done better, I would say, than any other team in football is they have built a consistent program and a consistent team. There was a lot of discussion last year that Georgia had really the best efficiency metrics that any of us have recorded from a modern football team, particularly on offense. Everybody talked about the defense, and they were phenomenal. Like, again, had the whole discussion, multiple standards of deviation, like tiers, however you want to call it, standards of deviation, multiple tiers better than other teams. But that offense was phenomenally efficient. And the F plus metrics, I think they were second or third, and they were the most efficient offense in the country. And so what they're able to do is just consistently move the ball, consistently score the ball, consistently keep you from scoring. And they were the boa constrictor machine that Alabama was for about 10 years before they made serious changes in their philosophy. And those guys come back. So from all this discussion about defense and everything else, at the end of the day, you have to concede if this offense is the consistent scoring machine it was last year, they're going to continue to put up points. Again, they were top 3 in the country at all points last year in terms of points per possession scored. They just don't play as many possessions, but points per possession, they were a phenomenal football team. And if they're that way again, then they're going to win games because every time you get the ball, they're still more likely to score than you are.
So I don't want to go negative, but what we are known to do is when we see a national championship caliber team, we got to pick at it a little bit. That's just what we do. Georgia fans know this because they've been elite for a while, and Ohio State fans get it, Alabama fans get it. So now Georgia's going to get it too. One of the concerns we had going into the SEC championship game, and we took a lot of heat from Georgia fans, but we weren't wrong, is as efficient as they were on offense, they couldn't stress you with a lot of explosiveness. And, we joke about the 5 tight end sets and how they've got all these maybe first round draft picks at tight end. And you can do a lot of things with that. But if you get in a hole, it's tough because you need that explosiveness to dig out of that hole. And a lot of times they don't have it. And Georgia fans are going to say, look, we put up 33 in the national championship game, but one of those was a pick 6. And you had 13 points in the fourth quarter. That in most cases isn't going to get it done to win a national championship. So, I don't know that even with the defensive personnel change and turnover, they're going to have a lot of holes to dig out of. But when we talked about the potential to be shocked against an Alabama, or maybe the potential to be shocked against a Kentucky or somebody because you've been ground up a little bit through the tough part of your schedule, what have they done this year, Josh, if anything, to change that limitation that they had last year. Even in the national championship year, you have warts, and that's one of them. Have they done enough, either in roster or potentially what we're going to see with scheme, that gives you more confidence that they're going to be a different level of offense that can dig their way out of a 2-touchdown
it's a difficult question. I mean, in theory, they're healthier on offense than they were. I mean, last year you do lose Blaylock to injury prior to the season. You do lose Washington to a foot injury. I don't feel like they really had all the pieces there at the same time. They didn't have Gilbert, and so I think they may have more stuff together than they had realistically. I mean, and I know they had those guys off and on, but we talked about that all year, that they weren't really healthy and they weren't really right, but they were winning despite it. And I think the offense could get some of those guys back. But even then, you get a blow, right, with Arian Smith getting hurt, where it still seems like you're still got Blaylock coming off an ACL. Smith gets hurt. It's sort of a maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back situation. So it's hard to say. The most difficult thing here is trying to evaluate the defense, because I don't think you ever can properly evaluate a defense that has this many new faces. And the assumption is it's going to be worse because on average it is, but it's not always that much worse. And I don't know what it's going to be. But what I do know is when you play a team like, Tennessee's a good example. Tennessee's going to have a lot of explosiveness this year. And if you get into a situation where, something weird happens, you have a fumble return for a touchdown, you get a punt block for a touchdown, they score a touchdown, you can get in a 21-0 hole. And that's really only a situation they were in once last season. And so I do think there's going to come a time where they end up in a hole, and we're going to find out what they're made of. And I think the potential is there, certainly, for them to win that game. And I think it's there if they play their brand of football, they stick to what they do, they can win that football game, and they probably will win the football game. If I'll say right now, not having seen the team play, if I were to pick every game, there is not a game on the schedule where I would pick Georgia to lose individually. But I probably would hedge towards saying it's more likely than not that they drop one game. It's probably about where I'm at in my mind. But there's no game, maybe there's a 15% chance they lose 7 games, and that comes out to your 1 loss somewhere in that realm. That's where I think Georgia is. Again, I don't think they're going to be as good as they were last year. They were a national champion last year. They bullied everyone all year except for one game, and the team that they didn't bully the first time, they bullied up and down, especially the fourth quarter in the national title. And they beat up on a really good Michigan team, almost like they were a second-tier program. So I don't think Georgia will be quite as good, at least to start the year. It'll be interesting to see how they develop over the course of the season. But I also don't think you have to be as good as you were in order to win a national title. And, it'll be interesting, right? Is this a situation where they're, 2012 Alabama, 2017 Alabama coming up a national title, or is it 2010 Alabama? I'm not sure which, but wherever they're at, I think it's only a temporary blip, and they're going to be better due to the recruiting at some point. I think it's going to be interesting to see how quickly they can reload, and basically just doesn't matter how well again, Alabama example, it doesn't matter how much talent you have in the roster. Sometimes those backups are good and sometimes they're not. You don't see until they step on the field.
I think Georgia goes 12-0. And we don't do a lot of preview predictions, but I think that Georgia is at a place where the young guys that are stepping up have been in a culture of winning and a culture of competition that, is creating elite talent that's just ready to go. It's next man up. I will be interested to see in this 4-game stretch that we keep talking about, Florida, Tennessee, Mississippi State, Kentucky. And by the way, 3 of those 4 are away from home. One's in Jacksonville, but 3 of those 4 are away from home. And I will be interested to see if they slow down a little bit, Josh. I don't think they're going to lose any of those games, but if they struggle, because that's one thing we do when we look at a schedule that's not particularly tough and we're judging you as an elite team, we look at your struggles. And I want to see how they handle that 4-game stretch. But in my mind, I think they go 12-0, and I think that either that 12-0 and that schedule means that they're healthier than they've ever been going into the SEC championship game, which is a good, but then that they have the potential maybe to get shocked again like they did against Alabama last year. All right, Georgia fans, let us know if we were off base on anything. Let us know about that 4-game stretch. Does it concern you at all? And do you think, I know the answer is probably yes, but do you think that the national media is not giving you a fair shake given that you're the defending national championship team? And don't forget, like, subscribe, make sure that notification bell is hit because, we go on our breaks and Google forgets about us a little bit. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.